You are listening to the Enormocast.
When it comes to Sportiva, I often praise the longevity of their venerated classics like the Mira. Because, well, if it ain't Baroque, don't fix it. Italian Baroque, that is. But as we know, I'm a stick in the mud whose glory days are well behind him. But you, dear listener, still have your best days waiting to jump out at you like a puppy wearing a backpack full of caramel corn. So hey, forward thinkers, let's take a gander at what's new over at Sportiva.com. The redesigned Cantana lace is an absolute edging machine. The updated Tarantula line provides comfort and performance at a price point for everybody. The TX2 Evo adds even more performance to Sportiva's stow-and-go approach shoes. And the new Mantra is a minimalist slipper so light and flowy, you'll swear you accidentally showed up to the gym in only your underwear. Just like in that dream you had last night. Don't worry, I just looked down too. So when it comes to keeping you thinking ahead, Sportiva is there with innovation at every turn. Why not see what's up and head over to Sportiva.com or follow them on Instagram. And remember, Sportiva is a proud sponsor of the Enormocast. Does your neck hurt playing someone else's project? Does your partner get in way over his head even on the warm-ups? Does the phrase, "I'll just do this move one more time," make your eyeballs spin? Then let Belay Specs fight for you.
When my boyfriend started falling lower and lower on his project, Belay Specs saved my neck and got me a new boyfriend.
Belayer neck pain, also known as BNP, can interfere with work, play, family, and snapping your head around at the gym to check out those abs. And you have rights, which are being crushed every time your partner yells take. So if your neck has been injured in an epic belay session, go to belayspecs.com to see if you qualify for a pair of belay specs and to get what you deserve. Enter Enormocast at checkout for a discount. Belay Specs is not licensed to give legal advice to anyone. Results may vary by steepness. If Belay Specs cause you to trip, fall down, run into a door, nausea, dry mouth, you're probably too high to climb to begin with.
All right, are we good? We done here? Does anybody want to get a beer?
We gotta get
Listen, where you playing in town? You playing here?
We're doing the Enormo Dome, whatever it is. It's terrific.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
a
big
house. We
place
sold
that
it out.
side of town. That's a
Very
big
nice.
place. You sold
What's
it
that,
out.
20,006?
I'll see.
You really should.
Look, you better get up there before you panic. Those pens are loose. You're very good. I have really enjoyed climbing with you. We'll make it. I don't think so. But we shall continue with style. Good weather, bad weather. Now or later, anytime is good for climbing.
Today's show is brought to you by Black Diamond Equipment, La Sportiva, and with support from Maxim Ropes. Maxim has been keeping the Enormocast off the deck since 2012.
And don't forget our charter sponsor, Bonfire Coffee. Go to bonfirecoffee.com and enter Enormo at checkout for a discount on great coffee and to support the Enormocast.
And now back to the show.
Hello and welcome to the Enormocast. This is your host, Chris Kalous. It is around noon, a nooner on the 9th of June, 2022, and this is episode 243 of the Enormocast, a conversation with climber, guide, Miranda Oakley. Have you heard of Miranda Oakley? I had not until her name came up in a conversation actually about rock climbing in Pakistan, but more in connection with her rock climbing in Palestine. But as soon as I started asking around about Miranda Oakley, everyone I talked to was like, oh yeah, Miranda Oakley, she's awesome. I love Miranda Oakley. Miranda Oakley kicks ass. So yeah, I was kind of in the dark about Miranda Oakley. And if you're in the dark about Miranda Oakley, that's about to change. Anyhow, I have a quick bit of business/request, and this is going to be very specific, and hopefully of the however many listeners hit this thing in the next couple weeks, somebody will go, maybe I do. I am looking for a photo or two photos or a few photos of a guy named Mike Bourquet. Anybody remember Mike Bourquet? Mike Bourquet, also known as Handsome Mike. I am looking for some pictures of Mike. So if you have any archived photos of Mike, he hung out in Yosemite, in the desert, I think he hung out in Waco a lot. He hung out in Gunnison, where I knew him best. And maybe by this conversation, you can tell that he has since passed away, which I won't go into the details of that. But I want to include him in a presentation that I'm going to do. So I'm having trouble picking up pictures of him. Not much on the internet, not much of high quality anyway. So any of you guys have a Mike Bourquet picture, please get in touch. Chris@enormocast.com or through the Instagram, although that's a little bit harder because if we're not following each other, it goes into some other file that's impossibly deep with stuff that I don't look at. So best thing to do would be Chris@enormocast.com. I appreciate it. I would like to do sort of a tribute to Mike, and I need some more photos. Cool. Thank you. All right, let's move on to Miranda Oakley. Super accomplished guide, super accomplished climber. How accomplished? Well, she's got first ascents down in South America, both in El Sultan, Patagonia, as well as Cochimo. She's an excellent, accomplished trad climber, has 513 flashes in Indian Creek, plus a wall climber. Plus, she holds the women's record for rope soloing the nose and is maybe the only woman to do it in under a day, under 24 hours. She's done the free rider, too. Yeah. Basically, you hook a rack at this woman, point her at a wall, and she'll climb it. But, I don't want to call Miranda Oakley an every person. I talk about the sort of every person interview that people ask me for sometimes because she's extraordinary in so many different ways. But the thing about Miranda that is, I think, encouraging and maybe kind of puts her towards that category is her entry into the climbing and how she got to be good and how she got to be a professional guide, and all these things is just surprisingly normal. And the truth is she just dedicated herself to it passionately and did all the right steps and moved towards her goals. And, I don't want to say again that she's not special, but it's a path that a lot of people who have doubts about this sort of life as a climber or wonder how it's done, if you will, she's got a good pathway maybe that a lot of us could follow. And obviously everybody has advantages and disadvantages, and Miranda had her share. But still, she went at it methodically. She decided to take some chances here and there with her life, and it's worked out pretty damn good. And she became a climber, and she's lived this very successful life as a climber. So yeah, maybe in here is a bit of a how-to if you're, stuck in a place like Maryland, like she grew up, and wondering, how do I get out there and get after my dreams and still maintain a little bit of comfort? Don't give it all away to the dirtbag life. And if you want to learn more about Miranda or learn more from Miranda, you can find her at mirandaoakley.com. And yes, she's a certified guide doing courses in California, but for the right price, hell, she'd probably do a course anywhere. Okay, let's get to it. A nice down-to-earth conversation with guide and climber Miranda Oakley. Do you remember those halcyon days back in January when every ray of sunshine felt like a warm hug from a celestial being? Skiing, climbing, we yearned for its caress. But now that it's dead summer, the tables have turned. The sun now stalks us like an enormous toddler with a magnifying glass. The burning orb, the Death Star, call it what you will. Just don't be caught out at noon on some edgy crimp fest lest your feet swell and your tips shred. But Black Diamond has a way to fight back. My favorite piece of BD apparel, the Alpenglow hoodie. Built with UPF sun protection, pits for movement, a hood designed to go under your helmet, and even some sort of odor control next-gen tech to help with that sour fear stink we all work up on the gnar. Or is that just me? Is that a thing with everyone, the stinky pits after being scared? But frankly, if you aren't basically living in a sun hoodie during the summer months, you may in fact be an iguana. But at least now, your tongue can go from 0 to 60 in 1/100th of a second. Don't just feel the burn, fight the burn. And check out the Alpenglow hoodie and all the great gear at blackdiamondequipment.com or your favorite local shop.
My first real guiding job was in Yosemite, working for the Yosemite Mountaineering School. Gosh, I started working in Yosemite like 2006, just washing dishes. And like slowly worked my way from that to like waiting tables. And then I was like a hiking guide for 1 year. And that's where I met, and that's, the boss for me at the time was the same as the boss for the climbing guides. And he knew like more or less what I was doing, because I was there to climb. Obviously, I was in Yosemite washing dishes, waiting tables, and then working as a hiking guide specifically so I could climb in the valley as much as possible and in Tuolumne. And so I was slowly building my climbing resume there, I guess, or my tick list. And my boss eventually was like, you should start on the AMGA track so that you can become a climbing guide here. And so yeah, I did my first class at the AMGA, and that's when I got hired as a guide in Yosemite. And then, yeah, every year after that sort of came back to work as a guide and continued with my guiding career classes with the AMGA. So,
yeah, and that's awesome. I mean, you're guiding hiking, you probably know what the Enormocast adage is about hiking, the long approach to nowhere. But and then you move into climbing, obviously, because you're like, well, I'm a climber, and a lot of guides, I think their first thing is like, oh, I'll get to be paid to go climbing, and then that can go either way, where it shatters your illusions, and you're like, this isn't really the climbing I wanted to do. So tell me a little bit about a transition of like thinking about, well, this is a way for me to, stay in Yosemite, make money, support my climbing habit, to, this is something that I'm going to pursue heavily and professionally. Did you have any trips or anything else that you can say is a standout moment when you were like, this is pretty cool, and this is, what I want to do for now?
Yeah, I guess I was also in this point in my life where I figured I can't just be like a dirtbag forever. Not that a climbing guide is that much better than that, but I just realized I needed like some stability, and I needed to work towards more of a career. And I did like guiding. I mean, I like guiding. I enjoy it very much. I think I have a good attitude for it. I've got a lot of patience. I mean, that's sort of something acquired as I got more into guiding, because that's one of the key elements of being a guide is you have to be very patient. But yeah, I guess at the time of my life where I started guiding, it was definitely also coincided with the time in my life where I knew I needed to kind of figure out more of a plan ahead, more than just like to the next season of climbing. And yeah, it's worked out pretty well. And people always ask like, what are you going to do when you get old and you're too old to guide anymore? And I kind of figured like that's when I'll really enjoy guiding, because I mean, mostly what I do is like the really moderate multi-pitches with people, and they're sometimes even easier than that. And that's, at least in the beginning and still now, I'm like sacrificing like having to go to work and guide these moderate multi-pitches for the climbing that I really want to do, which is, like bigger routes or harder routes or, whatever. But I'm like, once I get old, I won't want to do that stuff anymore. And I'll be psyched on climbing after 6 over and over again. So
yeah, getting old, I'll tell you. That's so funny because it's like the distance between, and I don't know how old you are, but I'm just going to gather that the distance between where you are now and when you're like too old to try to climb hard, there's a lot of time between now and then, and a lot of twists and turns and paths and changes. So I think it's funny that people are like, well, what's going to happen in 35 or 40 years when you can't try hard anymore? I think that's funny.
Yeah.
Because that's, having been in your very same position, someone I guided for 7 years, over about a decade, but 7 seasons. And yeah, life, what I imagined then and is what's happening now is like, yeah, they're completely disconnected. So
yeah,
I think that's pretty funny.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I remember thinking in terms of like, these quote unquote moderate days with clients, like, especially if you have more than one, like I remember being able to kind of focus too on like just my systems and how every time I would go out with the group, or like especially more than one client at a time, like you could be spending your time like, how efficient am I getting with this, and like where am I trimming inefficiencies out of the system. And I always felt like that really later on, like worked right into my climbing of especially of bigger objectives.
Totally. Like the efficiency game is like my favorite game, like trying to figure out ways to make the system more efficient, whether I'm guiding or on like a bigger climb.
Well, yeah, I mean, and one of the big things that came out in the media around you is having, rope solo the nose in under a day or in a day, which is basically just an absolute test in rope efficiency.
Totally.
So I could see how the two things would certainly go together,
Yeah, I like the problem solving aspect of climbing, whether it comes to like, boulder problem or rope systems. I've always enjoyed that like problem solving aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, and where did your sort of origins, your desire to climb come from? I believe I read it was a pretty typical gym start, getting into a climbing gym. But a lot of times I'm more interested in the question of like, when did it seem like it was a good idea to go all in? As even my last guest, Scott Franklin said, that this was going to be what I was going to do. Is a more interesting, sort of answer than like, oh, I went to a birthday party at a climbing gym, or I went, whatever happened. Like the more important thing in my mind is, when did you go like, wow, this is what I'm going to do?
I mean, I honestly did feel like that all along, even in the crappy climbing gym. I grew up in Maryland, and so we didn't have much more than like a climbing gym, and I started in the year 2000. So even the climbing gym that I went to wasn't even that great of a climb. It's nothing like the climbing gyms they have now.
Right.
And I kind of feel like if you get into climbing in that environment where it's like you're living in like one of the flattest places in the country and not even the climbing gym is that great, like, and you're still into it, then that's how you know you're like really into it.
When there's some plywood with some like old gross holds on it will like get into under your skin. The rest of it will, for sure.
Yeah, I remember getting like a staph infection from like the climbing holds.
Like, this is great. My hand is completely ballooned. Yeah. This is what I want.
Yeah.
Did you really get a staph infection from the climbing?
Yeah, well, I actually had climbed outside. Managed to get outside and had like a little cut in my hand, and then climbed in the gym after that, and then I got like a blister, I guess, like a giant like zit on my hand, and my whole hand was swollen, and my doctor said it was like staph or something. So.
Oh my God. I encountered that in the creek one time. This woman we were all camped with, this British girl named Francesca or something like that. But yeah, she obviously like let it go, and her hand was like, I mean, as big as my head by the time she dealt with this.
Yikes.
So she actually was courting disaster, as you do when you don't have any money or insurance. So but anyhow, but you're just throwing that old climbing gym under the bus. Is it still there?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to do that. I mean, it's just
no, I'm just joking.
The climbing gym has since it hasn't gone out of business, as like it's like one of those franchises. So they've got a few locations, but the one that I used to climb at is no longer there. Okay. But yeah, it was totally like the last generation of climbing gyms, like not this newer generation of climbing gyms that.
And how old were you?
I was 15. It was the year 2000. Okay. Yeah.
And what do you think it was about you, as a 15-year-old in Maryland, that path or that thing got into you? Because that's like a question I'm just endlessly fascinated on this podcast, and it's just like what it is that made 100 other kids go into that gym, and some of them have a good time and some of them don't, and some of them stick with it, some of them don't. But like, to get that under your skin to change your life, like what do you think it was about you as a person?
I mean, I guess it's kind of the same as what a lot of climbers kind of have in common, is like, I loved the outdoors. I liked going on adventures, even though I guess going to the climbing gym, at that point for me it was like an adventure, but it's all relative. I guess I also, I really wanted to be like an athlete, or I wanted to be athletic, but I sucked at team sports. So I would try basketball, and I was like terrible, just on the bench the whole time, like lacrosse, soccer, whatever it was I tried. I was just useless, like running around the field, like not knowing where to go kind of thing. And then when I started climbing, I was like kind of naturally like pretty good at it or okay at it at least. And it was just like fun, and I liked getting really tired, like physically from it. And I liked the aspect of problem solving, like I mentioned. Like I loved that bouldering was like mostly what I did at that point. And I loved that it was like solving a problem or a puzzle with your whole body. I thought that was like so cool at the time.
Yeah, I mean, in 2000, like you said, this is a fledgling gym at that point. You're showing up, this 15-year-old girl, into still, at that point, like kind of a boys and men's club that climbing was even in 2000. What was the community that you found? Were there other girls there? Were there other kids as excited as you were that were sort of became a cohort?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of found a kind of like community where I felt like I fit in a little bit better. I mean, I was never like a popular kid in high school. And then when I started at the climbing gym, I joined one of these like teams that are now like really competitive and really good. But we were just kind of having fun on the team that I was on. And there weren't a lot of women climbing, but there were a lot of girls like my age climbing. And I also found a way I was like, oh, I can like actually talk to boys here. I think like in high school, I like rarely talked to a boy. And the climbing gym, just like having that in common, I'm like, oh, I can talk to boys. Like, so, and then just like kind of being on the same playing field as like other people made me feel like I could talk to people and not be afraid of, sounding dumb or, I wasn't as shy anymore. I kind of came out of my shell a little bit. So I found the climbing community at the gym to be really good for that for me. It was kind of like other sort of like outsiders or people who were like on the fringe a little bit. And I just felt like I fit in a little bit better there. But
yeah, it was so much harder to find it, I mean, people talk about pre-gym era, but even then, like it was like a big leap to go find climbing at that point. It wasn't like in our face all the time. So you probably did end up with some kids that were like, kind of in the same boat as you were as far as connecting with other things in the world. Mm-hmm. And I think that's thematically a pretty common sort of sound, especially what you said about sports. I mean, not just on this podcast, but in my life, it's like, so many climbers I know who are these incredible athletes on the rock are just, you get into a basketball pickup game, it's like the most ridiculous thing you've ever seen in your life,
Yeah.
And myself included, What about getting outside into the climbing world? And sort of a big barrier was just simply where you lived.
Throughout high school, I was kind of limited to climbing in Maryland, which is like hike around to the top and set up top ropes on these 30-foot cliffs. Couldn't even really lead anything because of the rock there. And I didn't
that
have
sounds
to gear
ideal,
anyways.
frankly.
Yeah, it was actually perfect
to be honest
learn.
With you.
Yeah. I learned
Yeah.
how to build an anchor off of trees and like extend the master point over the cliff, And then I went to college in Southern Maryland, and that's where I met my friend Chris, who you mentioned earlier.
Chris Coleman, yeah.
Yeah, and we started like a climbing club there because we found out that the school had like this extra money set aside for like club sports. And we were like, oh, like if we like figured out like a loophole, we're like, oh, if we can like start a climbing club and they'll like buy us ropes, and crash pads and all this stuff. But we still had like no idea what we were doing. I think Chris bought like a set of quick draws, but he only bought like 9 of them or something like that. So we went to like the New River Gorge a couple of times and some other places in like West Virginia. And I remember like not having enough draws to do like most of the routes, like the sport climbing routes there. And we didn't even know what trad gear was. We were so fresh, so like such beginners.
So was it a climbing club of 2?
There was like 4 or 5 of us.
Were some other people?
We were in Southern Maryland, and it was still like, I would say, before climbing got really popular. So there wasn't like a lot of motivation. Like no one was like, oh yeah, I want to drive 7 hours to the New River Gorge so that we can maybe climb something. if we can find something that's easy enough that is only 7 bolts long.
Yeah, that's a pretty limiting factor.
Yeah.
I guess then it's the die is cast, as they say, as far as what's going to happen to you after you get out of college. Doesn't sound like you dropped out to become a climber, but you finished.
Yeah, I managed to finish college. It's probably good that I didn't climb during college, or else I might not have finished. And I didn't climb a lot. I like had those weekend trips every once in a while, but But yeah, then after college, and it was so flat where I went to school in Southern Maryland that I decided that I wanted to go like live somewhere where there was climbing. Like that was like my main goal. And my friend had worked in the High Sierra camps of Yosemite a couple of years before, and she was like, "Oh, this is like what you can do. Like you go to Yosemite, just got to pass a drug test, and then they'll give you a job and you can like wash dishes and you can climb as much as you want." And I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, that's what I need to do." So I did exactly that. Like drove out west with a couple of friends. Chris was one of the guys, and my boyfriend at the time, this other guy, and we packed all our stuff into this like Saturn coupe. We spent like a month like climbing in all these different places and using like Dr. Topo. I don't know if you remember Dr. Topo.
Vaguely.
As a guide, kind of like our makeshift guidebook for these different climbing areas. And finally we made it out to Yosemite. I applied for a job and started working there. And that's where I pretty much like cut my teeth with like climbing. I mean, I would really say I really learned how to climb there. I mean, I had been climbing a bit, had done some leading outdoors, had done a bunch of top roping and bouldering outdoors, but like, you know, Yosemite is where I really learned to climb.
I want to get a little more specific about where you climbed on the way, but also I'm trying to delve into I'm trying to create this archetype in my mind of these people that do this. And I mean, were you at all nervous to cut ties with sort of the normal path, you know, to set out with no money and no specific idea, or was it something that just felt like, you know, an intoxicating adventure?
I think at that point, I was just so excited to get out of Maryland that I wasn't even, I mean, I should have been nervous, but, you know, at the time I thought like $500 was plenty of money and I wasn't worried about money, you know, even though I didn't have much. And I just kind of assumed I would get a job and I wouldn't have to worry about it in like a month. And yeah, I mean, I should have been more nervous, like looking back at it. And I think if I did the same thing now, I'd be really nervous. But at the time, I was just so anxious or so antsy to like go climb like bigger stuff and, you know, actually like become a climber, you know, that I.
Well, I wanted to ask you about your parents too, because we're going to talk a little bit about that later as well, where they came from. But, you know, it's also this question that's always in my mind because they have to help facilitate, you know, especially even just driving your butt to the gym. If you were 15 when you started, a lot of people start even earlier, so they have to be on board with this. But then also, you know, my question for kids who are, you know, college bound, that's a lot of times coming from their folks too. And then, you know, the dropout questions in there, and then, you know, but then the other question is like, okay, what about their attitude when you were like, adios? I'm heading to the West Coast, you know, with $500 in a Saturn with two dudes. I'm out.
I definitely don't think they realized what it was going to turn into, because I think they were like, "Oh yeah, cool, honey, have an adventure. We'll see you in September," you know.
Sure.
And I was like, "Wait,
I'll help you put your resume together."
Yeah,
in September.
You can come back and get a real job, you know. Yeah, they definitely, even when my mom took me to the climbing gym for the first time, I don't think she realized like what exactly she was getting me into and what kind of like monster she was creating with that.
Right. But how did she adapt to that?
It took a long time for her to come around. I always tell people who are like in the same position with their parents, like, oh, just keep doing what you're doing. They'll come around eventually. Like, but I think it was like after I started guiding that she was more like, oh, okay, like, you know, this is something that is like more of a career. And I think now she's like looking at the climbing community and she's like more educated about it all. And she realizes like, oh yeah, climbing is like, there's like ways to make money off of it. I mean, at this point, I have no other skills to make money off of because I've spent so much of my adulthood climbing that I'm like, well, I don't even know what else I would do. So I've got to kind of figure it out. I'm committed to this track of life, you know? And
oh, I know.
Yeah, I'm sure you know how I feel. So it's like, but at the same time, we're really lucky because climbing is also getting really popular right now. And
right.
I mean, I just kind of, for me, that just feels like pure luck that like I spent so much of my adulthood trying to perfect this skill that's like otherwise almost completely useless. But now so many people are getting into it that it's like, okay, there is like a way to sort of make a living. I'm not like making great money, but I'm making, you know, I'm getting by. So
sure. Sure. And you're still pursuing your climbing dreams too.
I don't know if you know this, but I'm actually pregnant. I'm like 8 months pregnant right now. So I'm taking like a little bit of a break. And I'm shifting gears.
Now, I didn't know if you wanted to talk about it, so I wasn't going to bring it up. I didn't know that it was 8 months because I can only see your face too.
Yeah.
But you look great.
Yeah, if I stood up, you'd see the watermelon inside of me. They say it's a baby.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
How are you feeling about that?
I mean, I feel great. I'm at the point in my life where I've done, like, I've been able to accomplish a lot of my goals climbing. And, that was kind of like, how some people are like, oh, like if I have a kid, I need to do X, Y, and B. And it's usually has to do with their career or like things like that. For me, it's like, okay, well, if I have a kid, I want to do X, Y, and B. And they're all like climbing goals. And I feel like I've done enough of those, as of course, like the more climbing goals you complete, the more you have. And I still have a lot of climbing goals, but, I'm definitely feeling like, okay, I can like set that aside just for a little bit or like change, at least at the very least, change gears with my climbing. Like instead of focusing on long, adventurous routes, I can get really good at bouldering and sport climbing and stuff like that. Hopefully. I
didn't have to carry our child, obviously, but I had the exact same attitude when we found out that Steph was pregnant. I was just like, yeah, I've done plenty. And it ain't over, but you're certainly going to have to shift gears away from big, long times away from home and stuff like that. But I had kind of the same attitude of like, I'm not like clawing to do, the latest adventure that I dreamed up in my head anymore. So it should work out. But what is, what you're sitting here 8 months, which is
8.5 months.
Like I said, I had, Oh, I had no idea. So that's really fascinating. But, what do you see? I mean, you're probably wrong. No offense, but like, what do you see besides like, oh, I can't do big routes, but what is your life as a climbing mom and eventually a guiding mom when you get back to that going to look like, you think?
Well, what I'm hoping for is like I've never been disciplined about training before in the past. I've always just mostly just trained by climbing things that were like what I wanted to do, like
that's the trad climbing way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, but now I'm thinking like, oh, I live in Bishop and, we've got amazing sport climbing and bouldering and all this stuff. And I'm like, okay, well, if I train and get out maybe a couple times a week, even maybe I can start having different types of goals, certain single pitch climbs that I've always been interested in doing. And, eventually if I pursue that for a while, eventually I can take those strengths or like take my ability to try hard off the ground a little bit more, like once the baby gets a bit bigger and is less dependent on me. Anyways, that's the idea. That's like kind of what I've seen with parents, like getting strong bouldering and training. And I mean, I can train while the baby's napping, I think. Like I've got a hangboard, I've got a little home wall.
Yeah, it's all about motivation. The logistics of it are totally possible. It's the mental part of it.
Yeah. I mean, I fully expect to be like sleep deprived and tired for the first few months. So I'm trying to factor that in. I'm still thinking like, oh, like, okay, when should I get a gym membership? Or like, when should I try to buy some weights and things like that.
Right.
But,
you can hangboard while you're sleepy.
That's true. It's
not impossible.
Yeah. This doesn't require like complex thought or anything like that.
Yeah, that all sounds totally reasonable, and I think you can. Yeah, I think you're on the right track. Having been through it again, not as someone whose body changed so much, which will be part of the game as well. But you started out as a boulder, it sounds like.
Yeah.
In the gym, so
be
just
rekindle
that. Yeah, be full circle back to that. So. Yeah. And professionally, obviously, you'll have to take some time off. Where are you located?
So right now, I decided to do the whole birth and the first few months of motherhood in Santa Cruz because my partner and I both have family here. And
cool.
I don't know, there's like a NICU here for giving birth. We don't have that in Bishop. So I just figured this is like a better spot. And also my partner has work here as well. So we're going to kind of lay low here for a few months. And unfortunately, I'll kind of miss out on my Yosemite guiding season this summer. So it's kind of the worst timing for that, But my plan is to teach classes in the Eastern Sierra this fall. And that's something I've been doing on and off for years. I really love teaching classes. It's kind of like the less glorified part of climbing guiding. But for me, it like just presents these like different types of challenges. No matter how good you get at teaching a class, like you still have this like variability of the people in your class, and being able to kind of meet people at whatever level they're at and teach them these skills that they need to like be climbers has always been really engaging for me. I really enjoy that. So.
Well, and also just figuring out how they learn.
Yeah, exactly.
Because if you walk in, doing the same thing from the last group, it may not land on the next people. I say that only because I enjoyed the same thing. I guided in Colorado, but also in Southern California. Particularly was where I taught a lot of peer classes, and I enjoyed that even more than like just single guiding days. I also found it a lot less risky. I started to get a little bit concerned about the risk involved with guiding, in the mountains or just pure like climbing guiding. So the classes seemed a lot more in hand with that. But yeah, it was super fun. I always had a great time. I taught out at Joshua Tree so much that I used to say that I was solely responsible for Joshua Tree becoming overcrowded. Because I like taught so many people like how to hang top ropes and set up anchors and all that stuff, and then I would see them weekend after weekend. I'd be like, okay, yeah, this is my fault.
That's a great feeling though, to see the people that you taught how to climb like working it out on their own or figuring it out. But yeah, I mean, there's that double-edged sword of like, you're getting more people into the sport, which is exactly what we all complain about, right? It's like too many people getting into the sport, but I don't know. I don't really.
But you're doing it in the right way. I think you're doing it the right way. I mean, that's obviously like a bias because we did it or you do it, but you can, that whole like fear of the sort of wildness, unfettered like Jim to Crag thing. I feel like the guiding in classwork is like an intervention to that of like, hey, slow down.
Yeah.
Totally. Do this. You won't get hurt. And then while you're teaching those classes, you're sort of teaching crag etiquette and, being an example there too. So,
totally.
No, I felt pretty good about it all. And it's been cool because as I've, 10 years removed or more from that, I started this podcast and sort of, reintroduced my name to the climbing world. I've heard from a lot of those people actually like, oh, I remember when I took a class from you.
Oh, that's awesome.
So it is pretty cool. And I think you'll probably have that as well. When you, or a lot of your former students are going to hear this and be like, oh yeah, that's the woman I took that class from or whatever. So it should be pretty cool. All right. Well, let me shift gears. That was, I'm glad you brought that up actually. Cause I said, I wasn't necessarily going to bring it up cause I didn't even know how long you'd been pregnant, if it was early, how that was sort of like a personal thing to announce to people.
Yeah. Well, now it's like pretty obvious, people on the street stopping me,
No, I don't do that. Like a woman has to be like, like super seriously, obviously pregnant before I'm going to bring up like, oh yeah, are you pregnant? Cause you can walk into a very horrible faux pas with that one. Like I just saw a picture of Paige Clausen, right now, and she looks extraordinarily pregnant. So
yeah, I think there's like a few climbers who are exact same, like almost the same due date as me out there. I think Paige is one of them. And I think Nina is also, I think she's like 1 week. Nina Caprez is also pregnant 1 week behind where I'm at, I think. Something like that.
All right.
I just, other girls I follow on Instagram.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's always comforting, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah. So let me switch gears up because I definitely want to get to this because as I mentioned, it was part of the reason we got in touch, although so far we haven't even gotten there and this has been super fun. But the way I read it is your mom is a Palestinian immigrant. Is that correct?
Yeah.
But I did an interview where I talked to another person who brought up at least seeing a presentation you'd given about your connection to Palestine, having gone there and the climbing there. So can we talk a little bit about that and what your connection is, what your interest was, and what you actually did to sort of foster that connection with the climbing community?
Yeah, I love that you brought that up. It's like one of my favorite things to talk about. So,
oh, cool. Let's get into it.
Yeah.
Then.
Yeah, so my mom is Palestinian, and she moved to the U.S. in the 50s and met my dad. My dad's American, and I was lucky enough to like grow up kind of half in the Palestinian community because my mom has a bunch of Palestinian friends, and her whole side of the family are all Palestinians. So I got to see like, that cultural side of it. And then growing up in DC, my parents would often take me to these like rallies and stuff. And often they were about other stuff, but sometimes about Palestinian rights, but often about things going on in the Middle East, just due to like, the time that I grew up in.
And so you're talking like anti-war protests
mostly,
and things like that. Yeah.
Like the war in Iraq and all that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I don't even remember that stuff too much. And, after I got into climbing, the world of Palestine, sort of faded for me because I got into like climbing, the climbing community, and I found kind of like my place there. And I never really thought there would be any like intersection of that. Mm-hmm. But then randomly, my mom's friend sent me this like Al Jazeera article about these guys from wherever, but they were going to a college in Boulder. What's the name of that? Colorado College. The ones that all the climbers, the one that all the climbers go to. But
they definitely pump out some good climbers.
Yeah. But they ended up moving to Ramallah, which is a town in the West Bank in Palestine where my mom's from. And they started developing sport climbing areas there and sort of taking beginner groups out there. And they eventually went on to build a climbing gym there. And when I first heard about this, I was like, wait, what? There's climbing in Palestine? I'd always wanted to go to Palestine. And at that point, I'd only traveled to climb. Like I never gone on a trip to do anything else. So I wasn't even sure if I could go anywhere without rock climbing. And my family had mostly moved to the US. So like I didn't have a lot of family left there. So it's kind of intimidated by like going to Palestine just to go. But once I heard about these guys like who started a climbing community, I was like, oh, there's like Palestinian climbers that I could climb with. Like that'd be so cool. And I kind of like warmed up to the idea of traveling there. I started reaching out to one of the guys, Tim Bruns, who was out there taking people climbing and developing sport climbing areas. And I was like, well, what can I do? Like, I'll donate money, I'll donate climbing gear. And he's like, really, you just got to come climb with us. That's like the best thing you can do. And so, yeah, I did. In 2017, I traveled there for the first time. And it was amazing. It was so cool. At that point, the climbing gym had been built. So climbing gyms are just really cool places in general, like all over the world, for people to kind of come together and find community. Like I mentioned, getting into climbing myself at the climbing gym and finding a community there. But I think the addition of building this climbing gym in Palestine might have helped the climbing community become like more cohesive there. So anyways, like one of the first things I did when I got to Ramallah was go to the climbing gym. And I met all these people, and it was just amazing how like welcoming everybody was. And I mean, they were first just like, wow, you guys live in Yosemite and you came to Palestine to go rock climbing? And I was like, well, yeah. And then, of course, it would come out that my mom is Palestinian, and, I wanted to see where she was from, which is Ramallah. And then they were just like beside themselves, like right. Oh, that's so cool. Like, you're Palestinian. And, normally I wouldn't call myself Palestinian, because I'm fully like Americanized, but it was cool that they were like, oh, you're Palestinian. You're like a Palestinian climber. And I'm like, oh yeah. Like they just fully like accepted me into like the group and just made me feel super welcome. And they were already making me feel welcome before. And then telling them that, I was Palestinian, they were just like next level of like welcoming. And and then it was great. I got to like climb at all of the climbing areas, and some of the areas were in like kind of Palestinian territories, and those are nice because kind of I could go there with my new Palestinian friends like more freely, or they could travel there freely. And then some of the areas were in Israeli controlled areas of the West Bank or of Palestine. And those were a little bit harder. And that's where I learned, some of the struggles and the hardships and issues with freedom of movement that comes with like living in a militarily occupied area that the Palestinians had to deal with kind of daily.
Right. And were you able to move around?
Yeah.
I mean, what sort of your status as an American, tourist, if you will, that wasn't a problem for you to move around?
Yeah, and that was one of the things that kind of struck me about traveling to the area, is that I had more freedom to move around there than the people that were from there.
Kind of describe that a little more specifically, like what the life of a climber there sort of looks like. When you say these crags, are they fully developed? When you say the freedom of movement, is it possible to go outside of the sort of Palestinian territory for these people? And then, like, what does the gym look like even? So what's their life like as climbers?
So, yeah, it's really complicated, obviously. So in the West Bank, so when I refer to Palestine, I'm referring to like the West Bank, which is, if you look at a map, like depending on which map you look at, you might see like Israel just like include the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and you might see it as like the strip of land in between the two. But usually it's like kind of included. And so the West Bank is like this section of land in kind of like northern Israel that is along the Jordan River. And then Gaza Strip is another section of Palestinian land that's like down by the Mediterranean. And well, first off, like there's a ton of like climbing also in Israel proper, but Palestinian climbers for the most part are not allowed to go there. And then throughout the West Bank, you think of it, this is Palestine, this is Palestinian land, but it's not, like it's under military occupation by Israel. But then a lot of it is just taken over by Israeli settlers. And so they've got like neighborhoods, like about 60% of the land in the West Bank is actually controlled by Israel. And so for climbing there, when Tim and Will, the guys from Boulder who went out there to develop climbing, when they set out to develop climbing for Palestinians, they actually specifically developed climbing in areas that were controlled by Palestinian Authority. And that was on purpose so that Palestinians would have like freer access to these climbing areas. Sure. And then there's a couple of climbing areas that are in Israeli-controlled parts of the West Bank. And Palestinians can still go there, but that's when you see like their freedom of movement really restricted. Like, for example, one of the areas that I kind of climbed at the most is called Ain Fara. And that was an Area C, so an Israeli-controlled area of the West Bank. And if I wanted to go there by myself or with another American or with an Israeli, it was a quick drive from the city. I could bypass certain checkpoints and I could drive right into this settlement that sort of sits on top of the canyon that the climbing is in. And I could just drive right down to the entrance of the nature preserve where the climbing was in. And it was literally like a 5-minute walk from the parking lot to the climbing area. But then if I wanted to go with my Palestinian friends, oftentimes if we were in a Palestinian vehicle, they would have certain plates and that would restrict them to certain roads in the West Bank. And so being on those roads, there would usually be a lot more checkpoints. So military checkpoints where they would stop every single car and check their IDs, or sometimes just like stop them, search their car. Sometimes they would just wave them through, but it would just create like a bunch of traffic. So you'd be waiting in traffic. And then the Palestinians weren't allowed into, or at least not allowed to drive into the settlements. So we would have to park outside of the settlement and then walk around like 45 minutes. It was a beautiful hike, but we would have to walk 45 minutes around the settlement down and drop into the canyon from like the other side of the canyon. And so, it was interesting. Like, sometimes I'd be like, I want to go climbing this afternoon. I don't have a lot of time. And my Palestinian friends would be like, well, you should just go. You and Tim should just go climbing because, you'll be able to, get there in like 20 minutes. But if you wait for us, or if you go with us, then it'll take like, 2 hours just to get there. And so that's what was kind of like jarring and, disturbing about the whole thing. Like, because I'm American, I can do all these things that like the people that actually live here can't do, or the people that are from here aren't allowed to do.
When I think about Palestine, the Israeli Palestine conflict, and I don't know too much about it, but then I start to think about climbing. The question sort of is like, why bother? Like, why is this important to people's lives who have all these other, possible hardships and and things going on politically, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like what is like in your mind, and this isn't like a gotcha thing. I just want to know, like, why do you think it's so important that people and your friends Tim and what's the other guy's name?
Will Harris. I never actually
Will.
met
Yeah,
him because
yeah.
he left before I got
Right.
there, but
You know, is it just pissing into the wind? Is it important? How do you feel about it? How does it fit into these people's lives that you met in terms of how important it was to them as well?
yeah, I mean, that's definitely a good question. Like, I mean, I would definitely have thought that before going over there too. Like, what's the point when people are struggling to just like go to work in the morning because of the lack of freedom of movement there and their daily struggles? Like, why bother teaching these folks how to climb? But I mean, I guess I would say because it matters to them. Like my first day climbing there, we went to Einfada, and because we had this like really long hike down, I ended up talking to this Palestinian climber who told me about all this like kind of terrible stuff about his life living under the Israeli occupation. But he loved climbing, and that was like, he was like really into it, and kind of like, it was like a way for him to almost like escape what was going on there in a way. And not even like he could like physically get out of there. Like he's pretty restricted and it's hard for him to travel to other countries. But like being able to go into this beautiful canyon to go climbing almost is a way to like make him feel more normal, I guess, or not. I don't want to say normal, but like a way for him to kind of like forget about some of the stuff that's going on. Being there and climbing there definitely made me think about freedom of movement a lot more, because that's like the biggest thing, right? Is like, that's like the day-to-day struggle for most Palestinians, is like their ability to move about is greatly diminished. And I think that's like part of the reason why we all love climbing, right? Is because we get to experience this kind of like very physical like freedom to move around on the rock and do whatever we want. Like most sports, you know, you have like these rules, like you have to move in certain directions and things like that. But with climbing, like, I mean, aside from just going up, like there's not a lot of rules for like how you have to move. And so you get a lot of freedom within that to like, so that seems like it's a really positive thing for the Palestinians living in these conditions.
So I'll ask a more basic base question.
Yeah.
You know, as we go into these like deeper topics, I'm actually kind of curious, like, what's the climbing like? Is it good? What's it on? Is it limestone? What are we talking about?
Yeah, it's great. It's all like single pitch limestone climbing. And there is, I think, some sandstone like up north near the Jordan River, but I don't know how good that is. But the limestone climbing there is great. It's like typical, like kind of, you know, it's all like a lot of it's newer, like especially the stuff in the Palestinian territories. It's all like pretty fresh. So some of it's kind of sharp still. And then, yeah. And then and then in the canyons, you have more of these like tufa, like overhanging, like cool, like more typical limestone features, which are really cool. But yeah, it's all like single pitch. I highly encourage like a climbing trip to the Middle East, especially if single pitch climbing doesn't quite satisfy your international traveling, like climbing needs. There's also Wadi Rum that's like a few hours away in Jordan, where you can find 2,000-foot sandstone walls as well. So just a little plug for like a climbing trip to the Middle East for anybody who might be interested. But
you made a I guess wasn't a joke, just a statement about never traveling for anything but climbing, which really resonated with me as well, because, you know, you've only got so much time and money. It's like, why would I just go wander around a place when I can go climbing? But which sounds sort of like, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? It sounds kind of dumb, actually. Isn't the word I'm looking for, but that one works. But what I've also found is that these climbing trips to these places, they actually do insert you pretty deeply in the culture in a way that, like, you know, going to a city and going on a tour, or like staying in some nice hotels or whatever normal people do, and they go to Europe, getting on a train, moving around, seeing the sights. I've always found that you actually are in almost automatically. You're often in these unheralded places, even thinking of Spain, like being up in a village somewhere in Catalonia versus in Barcelona, like the difference of the integration with the culture that you
Yeah.
get. And I actually have climbed in Wadi Rum and traveled through Jordan anyway. And yeah, it's just like you are automatically interfaced deep in the community. And the other interesting thing I've found is when you're on a shoestring budget, which you almost always are as a climber, again, you are like at the sort of common person level as you travel through the country. You know,
Yeah.
it may seem like you're being cheap, but the fact is that you're eating at those restaurants with those folks, and you're integrated in a way that I just don't think, you know, sort of a more wealthy sort of tourist type trip is ever going to do for you. And I found that to be really the case traveling through Jordan on a shoestring budget, you know, to go to Wadi Rum.
Yeah, I feel like Wadi Rum in the south of Jordan is a perfect example of that because, you know, like most of the tourists are only staying a couple days in any given spot. And they come in, they go to the Bedouin camps, you know, they have like a fire with like, where, you know, they cook the food underground and stuff. And then they move on to Petra, you know, and they do the next thing. And I think also one of the things that climbing does for me is it encourages me to stay for like a longer time in any given area. So I was in that first trip to the Middle East, I was in each area for a month. So I was in Jordan for an entire month and I was in Palestine for an entire month. And it just allowed me to like really connect with people on a deeper level rather than, I feel like as a tourist, you kind of you stay a little bit more separate. I mean, obviously I'm still a tourist,
yeah, for sure.
but doing those touristy
Right.
things, you're kind of a little bit more like separated from the community and the culture.
You know, when I knew is that when the guys stopped hawking, you know, camel rides and shit to me, you know,
Totally.
and they stopped saying like, no tourist price for you. You know, they're just like, hey, hey, there's that guy again. Like, you know, that's when you know you've like at least ascended descended a level a bit, when they're just like over you a little bit. Like
Totally.
You're just a guy that, or in your case, you're just a woman that's there, and like their fascination with you or their attempts to sell you shit has moved on. Then you're like, okay, we could probably have a conversation now, you know, or at least a slightly more or less kind of veneered conversation where I'm a tourist and you're trying to sell me something. We maybe could get beyond that. It's hard. I mean, even a month, it's hard. And with that culture, it's very hard. And I'm assuming, you know, being a woman in that culture makes those conversations trickier as well. I don't know. Did you go on a camel ride?
I never rode a camel.
I hate to undercut their business.
I went on a lot of
it's not that great.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like that. The Jeep rides were really fun. I went on a lot of Jeep rides, and that was fun.
Raging across the middle of the desert in a Toyota Land Cruiser or whatever.
Yeah, they're a lot faster than the camels too to get to like the climbing areas.
Yeah. But I mean, on a different note, how did you feel sort of traveling in those countries as a woman?
Yeah, I mean, in Palestine, it was different because I don't know. In Ramallah, it's like a big city, and you see women wearing everything from like. I mean, you don't see a lot of burqas there, but you see women wearing hijabs all the time. But then you see women, you know, wearing like tight jeans and their hair and makeup and all that. And so you see the whole like gambit. I don't know. I mean, I was like embedded in this climbing community. And I think as in the United States, climbers tend to be a little bit more well off and a little bit more well educated. And so I didn't see a lot of like what people would stereotypically think of like this like gender divide in the Middle East. And I'm sure it exists. And in Wadi Rum, I saw that a bit more. I mean, Wadi Rum and Amman, Jordan, like the capital of Jordan, might as well be two different countries, right? Because it's so different.
I 100% agree. Yeah.
But Wadi Rum was definitely like a little bit more eye-opening because women there did wear burqas and you know, sometimes in some cases weren't really like allowed to leave the house, I guess. Like I didn't see a lot of women out there. And so that was kind of weird. But
you know, it's what I thought was kind of strange too is that you would see a lot of sort of young girls, like kids, and then like sort of tween, early teenagers were still out and about, and then in you know, in sort of whatever clothes they had, and then all of a sudden it was like there was a cutoff point, and that was like you wouldn't see actual women, or you'd see them behind fences or, going about their day,
Yeah.
but in burqas and things like that.
Yeah.
So it was like, I was like, wow, where's the cutoff point, and then their life completely changes.
Yeah.
I mean, and again, these are rural villages, so they tend to be older in their ways and more conservative.
Yeah.
Than, like you said, Amman was a very, very modern city,
Yeah, it's totally different.
Yeah.
It was like, I was even hanging out with Jordanians in Wadi Rum who were from Amman. It was like they were almost like foreigners, like in this town, like almost as foreign as I was in this town, because it's just so different.
I had one other last question about your experience in Palestine. You mentioned Israeli climbers, and I know there's a lot of them. I ran into some of them in Wadi Rum, and in Spain, and I'm friends with a couple. In your experience, did you sort of cross that line and end up climbing with Israeli climbers as well when you were down there?
No, I guess short answer would be no. I mostly just climbed with Palestinian climbers. I did have some interactions at specifically the climbing area that I mentioned that was in the Israeli controlled part of the West Bank or Palestine, called Ain Farah. And that was interesting. Everyone was super nice, and I definitely felt like I could relate more to the Israeli climbers because, a lot of them were, from like the US. And so it was really easy to get along with them. And we had less cultural barriers, I guess. That part was cool, but I never specifically climbed with them. It was kind of like I would see them at the crags and we would interact and have our niceties and talk about, oh yeah, I'm a climbing guide in Yosemite, yada yada. And that was pretty much it.
Right. I have this naive, pie in the sky bullshit attitude that the climbing community is this one great leveler and we can all get along and things like that. And is there any sort of cultural crossover between the two groups, or are the sort of politics too big?
I mean, I'm sure there is. I've heard of some of the people in the Palestinians in the climbing community there climbing with Israeli climbers. Yeah, I kind of thought the same thing when I went over there. Maybe we'll have this magical moment where the Palestinian climbers and the Israeli climbers come together and they realize climbing is the great equalizer. But no, I mean, I think part of the reason for that.
It's too complicated for that. We're not that dumb.
And they're just
to really believe that can happen.
It's one of those things that you want to think it could happen, but I think the reality is that there's just too much disparity in, people's rights there, where you have this group of people who's part of this occupying nation who are actively participating in settler colonialism. And a lot of times the climbers won't be, but they're part of that movement just inherently because, they're Israeli. And then you have the people who are firsthand being affected by that, people whose homes have been destroyed, who have been to prison for no good reason. And then, there is the access to climbing that's different as well. So just on a basic climbing level. So like I mentioned, getting to the crag in the West Bank. So in the Palestinian, what is considered Palestine by international borders, but it's under Israeli control. So it's so much easier for the Israeli climbers to have access to that than it is for the Palestinian climbers. And then not to mention, the climbing all over Israel and just moving about from Israel to these areas in the West Bank. Even a lot of Israeli climbers might not even be aware of, a lot of climbers tend to be more progressive, more educated. So I'm sure there's a lot of Israeli climbers that are well aware of what's going on in Palestine. And, would like to do something about that, but it's I'm sure their hands are pretty tied, just
Yeah, I mean, it's a terribly thorny issue, and with that said, we're talking about your experience, and certainly, and I'm sure I'll hear about it, but there probably is plenty crossover on individual levels and sympathy between the groups, and yeah. So I mean, I'm certainly not we're not drawing this black and white line. We're just talking about your experience. I want to kind of put that caveat in there because I've met and know Israeli climbers that don't harbor any sort of deep political ire. It's part of their it's just I don't believe in everything that our goddamn government's doing
Yeah.
either, especially today,
Yeah.
right now. So, so anyhow, I just was kind of curious if you'd had any sort of experiences with that.
I mean, that's one of the reasons why I feel like I can relate even more to the Israeli climbers than the Palestinian climbers, is because my government is responsible for some terrible things, and they've spread their tentacles all over the world to different countries and affected all these different people.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to be associated with that. Like, I don't support that necessarily. And so I have to like consider that whenever I meet any Israeli, especially Israeli climbers, that, just because their government is responsible, like their government is separate from them, right? So their government is responsible for some pretty terrible stuff, but they don't necessarily want anything to do with that, and they might like vehemently disagree with what their government's doing as well. So
we have no idea. And certainly Wadi Rum has that, has Israeli climbers and guides down there that have certainly crossed the cultural line in positive ways and things like that. So since that 2017 initial one, your connections remained?
Yeah, my connections, I mean, I haven't been keeping in touch lately as much as I would like to, but I did go back for another trip in 2019, and I organized like this little like climbing event in Wadi Rum for Palestinian and Jordanian climbers mostly, to like come climb together. And then I taught like a little trad lesson there because I was like, how can I contribute? And that's like about as much as I could contribute. So I helped with some other folks in the area. I helped organize this little event, and we had a really, really good time. It's like cool to see everybody again. And then I went like from there, I climbed a little bit more in Wadi Rum, and then went back to Palestine again. And I got to participate a little bit with like these programs that some of the Palestinian climbers were doing, taking like refugee kids out climbing to like the beginner areas, and I think I even like did a little class with some of the like core group of climbers in Palestine. That's like a big thing there. Like they have this group called Wadi Climbing, and that's also the name of the climbing gym. And they will often do these trips where they take beginner climbers out, and that's how like more people get into the sport. And they're like really affordable, like little climbing trips that people will go on. Mostly I was just telling them my tricks for risk management, because like I think out of all the guiding I do, like teaching beginners is one of the sketchiest, because I'm teaching multiple people how to belay, and it's their first time out climbing. And I'm one guide, sometimes with up to 6 people in those classes, and so I have to teach people how to belay each other. And I just like taught them some tricks like backup belayers, and just being really like vigilant when people are lowering each other, because that's kind of sketchy, and like teaching people like how to stand at the crag so that they don't drop each other. But yeah, I mean, people always like think of like guiding beginners as like the easy part of the job, but it's actually like really stressful. Especially if you're teaching people how to belay. If you're just like a belay monkey all day, that's not a big deal. But if you're teaching people how to belay, it can be like there's a lot of potential for things to go wrong if you don't do it right.
Yeah,
so
it's like giving your kid the car keys for the first time. Yeah. I noticed just this little blip that you actually went and guided in China at one point as well. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that seems like another great cultural leap to take, like going to Palestine in its own way.
Yeah, so that was back in 2007, I think was my first trip to China. And I worked for this little company there called China Climb. They're pretty much like an outdoor education company. There's a lot of international schools in China, and they pretty much like took kids from those schools and did like an outdoor education like week, and climbing is one of the activities that they would do with kids there. And so that was kind of, I guess, my first climbing guiding job. It's just single pitch, like putting up routes for these kids and belaying them. And that was a lot different than what I started doing later on when I started guiding for Yosemite Mountaineering School, because, that was just like, putting ropes up and belaying kids. Whereas working for Yosemite Mountaineering School, we're required by the Park Service to be an educational service. And so, at the most basic level with them, I have to at least teach them like leave no trace, how to belay, how to become like little mini rock climbers, versus where I was working in China was like, just pretty much like introducing kids, like just giving them a little taste of the sport. But
And are we talking about Western kids that are there?
Some of them were.
Or Chinese
a lot
kids?
of them were Chinese kids. A lot of kids were from
Mhm.
other places in Asia. A lot of kids.
Mhm.
There was a lot of American-born Chinese kids there. Chinese kids who were American but had moved back because
Right.
their parents like got a job in China. I guess foreigners in China, at least while I was there, their kids couldn't go to the public schools, so they had these like international schools in China for all the expats, all the people who were from other countries or had citizenship outside of China, or just parents with means would send their kids to these international schools, and that was like generally our clientele. But I was working in Yangshuo, China, so I don't know if you've been there. It's a pretty popular climbing area.
No.
For
I know,
foreigners.
yeah. I know the pictures
Yeah,
and stuff. Sure.
it's beautiful. So yeah, then we also did like on the weekends, sort of as like a side hustle, we would also just like guide foreigners who would come. But
Sure.
our staff was like half Chinese people, half foreigners. And so we had like a big base of people because within China, it's like insanely popular to like travel within China. So we actually had a lot of like Chinese tourists coming through that town. And so, like they would take the Chinese people climbing, and I would take the people who only spoke English climbing, or the English speakers
Right.
climbing for obvious reasons.
What was the experience like, just on a personal level? Your sort of day to day being in China in a place like that.
Yeah, it was kind of, for me, it was like a kind of a great gateway into traveling and being in different parts of the world, because again, like I had no money, and working for that company, they sort of like took care of me a little bit. Like they gave me a place to live. They would feed us dinners every night, and we got free beer. So that was like the deal working for them. We got paid like a small amount. We got a free place to live and beer and dinner. And so I could like pretty much live there without like having
Beer and
much
dinner.
money. And I just wanted to pay for my plane ticket
Right.
over there.
You could get drunk
Yeah,
for free.
well, it's hard to get
Climber's
drunk
dream.
off of Chinese beer, not
on
gonna lie.
Chinese beer, yeah, I bet. Yeah.
Pretty watered down. But we did it.
Yeah.
We managed to do it.
I imagine.
sometimes.
That's I lived in Alta, Utah, and everybody not from there was like, "How do you get drunk on 3-2?" I'm like, "Dude, you can get super drunk on 3-2."
So to like not eat anything all day
Anyway.
and go climbing all day and then drink
Right.
like chug a beer and then maybe. Yeah.
Stand up and sit down a bunch of times. Like, yeah. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, overall, it must have been a pretty wild cultural experience.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, we were like half foreigners, half Chinese people, but like, I was hanging out with other Americans there. I wouldn't say that I was just like immersed in Chinese culture.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, like we talked about earlier, just being in an area for an amount of time, you make a little bit like more connections with people. You get to know people who are locals to the area a little bit more than you would just like passing through, even just for a climbing trip. Because that trip I was there for like 4 months or something.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, going back to like maybe ram this point home, but even like going and buying your whatever from the same person every day, which you tend to do in those towns, like even again like in Catalunya, like I always joke that I finally like broke through the lady who was selling me Hamon's like burly Catalonian exterior, but it took like 4 weeks, to get like a smile out of her, like a acknowledgement that I existed, even though I'd bought Hamon from her for like weeks on end.
Yeah.
But it's funny because in Mexico too, I remember those feelings of like you show up at the same stall to get some fruit from the same lady, and pretty soon she's like, "Hey," and we're talking, as best we can or whatever. So it's pretty funny like that. I'd imagine China's kind of a similar vibe.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, we've talked a lot about your guiding, what you've done for sort of other people. Let me ask you a question, and you can think about this for a minute because it's going to be a little bit out of the blue and weird. But, I've got all these like lists of things that you've done as a climber. We didn't really get into, that amazing feat of rope soloing, El Cap in 21 hours or whatever it ended up being, setting the women's record for that. If that's important to you. And I've got some other stuff, Patagonia First Ascents and things like that. So can you think of, and maybe, we'll finish by just talking about, a day or a trip or an experience or even accomplishment that's like the one you like to tell, like that you actually are willing to kind of spray about a little bit. That was even if it wasn't the hardest thing you did, like an experience, and maybe it was the nose, maybe we could talk about that. But what pops to your mind of like, that's a moment I was like, I'm a climber. This is real. This is what I love to do.
And everyone always wants to know about the nose because it was like a first, I guess. Sort of. I was like the first woman to solo the nose in less than 24 hours. But I think, like, for me, that was like a natural progression. Like, I know it's like not a super common thing that people do, but given the community that I was in at the time, or am in, it made a lot of sense. And there's kind of quite a few people, a few of my friends, a few of my coworkers who've done it. And so it didn't seem that like crazy to me at the time. I think one of my biggest accomplishments as far as like having to use all my skills that I've ever learned rock climbing would have been like freeing the free rider. And that's like kind of cliche, because like now everyone's done the free rider. But I feel like, especially at the time, I just felt like, I'm using every skill
I've never heard of it.
Learned.
I don't.
Yeah.
I don't know what you're talking. Is that like in El Dorado?
I gotta
or
do that without a
rider?
rope. It shouldn't be that hard, right?
Anyway, I interrupted, but yeah, talk a little bit about that. That's fine.
I mean, yeah, I guess it's like a lot of people probably have like a similar story, but just like being able to use all my skills as a climber. And then, I never like free climbed anything on El Cap before, obviously. So normally like we're just like totally different style of climbing while you're up there. And so just like learning the ways free climb on a big wall rather than just, Jumaring and aid climbing. And then, it's like the higher you got is like the more scared you were that like you were going to fuck it up and not send the route. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But yeah, just like like emotionally it was like pretty hard, and mentally, because like once I got like a bit higher and I was actually like, oh, I could do this, then I was like had this like not like fear of falling, because at that point my head was pretty good. I wasn't afraid of like leading above my gear at all, but definitely the fear of like failing, I guess. It was like emotionally taxing towards the top. And
sure.
Yeah, I just feel like I had to like overcome all these different things I had never really had to deal with, like on shoulder climbs or on, just like aid climbing bigger routes.
What was the style that you did it in?
I mean, I wouldn't say we had the best style because we wrapped in and stashed some water and cans of food higher up. And a lot of times when I've like tried to like cheat my way through things, it's kind of backfired on me. So we were like, okay, we'll rehearse the moves and stash some water and stuff like that. And then of course, like it was too crowded. We couldn't rehearse any moves and a lot of the water was gone. So not all of it. We still had water and we had like cans of food that we had stashed. But like on the nose too, I stashed some water, but it was gone by the time I got up there. So like try to cheat, but it kind of backfired.
Is there some, I mean, we always used to date ours. Is there some like protocol to get people to not fucking drink your water?
Thirsty, you're thirsty. I've been there,
Right.
If you're really thirsty, you can't blame someone for drinking your water. There's water up there and you're going to drink, like if you're about to die of thirst, like, I mean, not die, maybe not die, but.
Right. Well, really, that's the question, isn't it? How thirsty were they actually?
Hopefully, I think they were pretty thirsty. It was hot up there.
Yeah, but it didn't shut you down.
No, yeah, we had just enough water. And it's actually, for anybody who's interested in trying the free rider and like wrapping in, it's so much work to like go to the top, fill your jugs with the spring, rappel down. Like it's so much work. I would say it's almost not worth it. Like maybe just barely worth it. Something to factor in for those folks who are like, oh yeah, we're just going to make it easier. It's like a lot of work. Wouldn't necessarily.
How long were you up there on the ascent? And did you just have to try it once?
That was my second time trying it. And we were up there. I think the first time I was up there almost 7 days. I was up there like 6 days or something. And then the second time it was only like 5 days, I think.
Have you had since then other free climbing El Cap goals?
Well, I always wanted to go back and do that in a day. And I guess that would still be like my main goal. The other thing I was thinking, just because it looks so awesome, is the Salathé, the head wall of the Salathé. I pretty much would do like the free rider, but then the Salathé head wall I think would be amazing, just because it looks so cool. And then, I mean, all the free routes on El Cap look amazing, you know, like the heart or like the El Corazon and the muir wall. Now I know how to do
maybe not in the
2-to-1, so
maybe not in the next couple of years anyway. You might have something else going on.
If I'm lucky, I'll get to train, and then we'll see.
Yeah, exactly. Alrighty, folks, thanks for listening, and thanks to Miranda for getting that done. Once again, if you want to find out more about Miranda, especially what she's doing professionally, you can go to mirandaoakley.com and see what she's got going. Maybe you can find her in Yosemite on the east side and take a course once she's back on her feet from her next challenge, bringing forth a human life. Speaking of human life, watch out for your own human life out there when you're climbing. Of course, be safe, have fun, and check your knots.
But if you can get people to consent to the state of affairs in which they are living, the state of servitude, the state of being, well, it seems to me that the nature of the ultimate revolution with which we are now faced is precisely this, that we are in process of developing a whole series of techniques which will enable the controlling oligarchy, who have always existed and presumably always will exist, to get people actually to love their servitude. People can be made to enjoy a state of affairs which, by any decent standard, they ought not to enjoy.